Hello and welcome back to Visited by Voices Live. It is Saturday, the 6th of June already, in a year that seems to have flown by as we've all been trapped in our houses, not going outside and social distancing. But one thing we're not going to do today is social distance via the internet, because I'm joined today by horror royalty, who's going to blush every time I say something like that, and that's just fine. I've told the story before about how there was two televisions in my house, one upstairs, which was a small black and white television, and one downstairs, which is a color set that I had no control over. So all my formative years were spent with that small black and white television upstairs, and the UHF stations would play older, generally speaking, horror sci-fi films in the middle of an afternoon on a Saturday. And I fell in love with those films, and I didn't realize they were as old as they were. The 1930s might as well have been the 1960s or 1970s, because everything was in black and white on that set. And my mind just exploded in so many directions with so many films. But if there's one film, one moment that set me on a trajectory of loving the horror genre, it was my first encounter with The Bride of Frankenstein. I don't mean the title character, I mean the entire film. It was a fairy tale, it was a morality story, it was an extremely subversive piece of agitprop entertainment for its time. And it played as well when I saw it in 1979 as I'm sure it did on screen in 1935. A big reason for that is the central performance, which is not the title performance, but rather the monster. Frankenstein's creation, played by the unintimidable Boris Karloff. We're joined by his daughter today, and as I said to her just moments before we went on the air, this is as close as I'll ever get to meeting Boris Karloff. So it is with immense pride and not a little bit of butterfly in the stomachs that I'd introduce Sara Karloff.
Thank you very much for that lovely introduction.
I didn't write that. I just did that.
I'm impressed.
It's genuine. It's very easy to talk about old monster movies for me because they're so much a part of me, and they're a part of a lot of our audience. Already we have people, as they came in, I asked them to talk about their favorite of your father's films, and they're already throwing out some titles that made me smile just to see them, because maybe I was a little wrong. Maybe this central image I created didn't have to be the big titles, because I'm seeing a little bit more of deep cuts there, and I'm pretty happy for that. But your dad, is that what you referred to him first off? Did you call him father? Did you call him dad?
Dad.
Dad?
Daddy, but dad.
Daddy. So let's start there before I get into the career proper. Like, who was William Henry Platt to you?
Who was he? That's probably one of the toughest questions to answer. He was very private, very modest, very funny. He was very well educated. He was very articulate, very soft-spoken, very gentle of soul and spirit. He was very kind. He was very self-effacing. He was all those things and so much more. He never talked about himself. He never talked about others negatively. He never complained about anything. The thing that angered him the most, I think, was injustice of any sort. He was a remarkable human being, and he's one of the very few people in the business about whom nothing negative was ever written or said. It's amazing. And my godmother, who wrote one of the biographies on him, said that when she was interviewing people for her book, almost to a person, everybody prefaced their remarks by saying, "Oh, dear Boris," and that's what she titled the book.
His reputation through the ages in every piece of research I've ever come across has referred to him as a gentleman. That
That he
seems to be the
was.
that seems to be the word that most often was described by the people who knew him. So he spent 50 years making films, from 1919 in serials until months before his death in 1969, including an incredibly busy 1968, but we'll get to that. He won 2 Grammys for spoken word performances for narrating children's performances. He has 2 stars on the Hollywood Walk of Fame, and 3 U.S. postage stamps have been dedicated to him, which is something that is not true of any other actor. So, your father was not only a great man privately, but what he did for the motion picture industry is really something I don't think anyone has achieved since.
Well, he also was one of the founding members of the Screen Actors Guild. His card number was number 9. And in 1933, when SAG was being formed, it was very dangerous business for those 12 forming actors to be even involved with the formation of SAG. My mother told me that they would park their cars blocks away from one another's houses and then walk to the meetings. They would go to parties, and on the dance floor, they'd dance by one another and whisper, "Meeting Tuesday night at so and so's house," and dance on by. They were putting their careers on the line and running the risk of never working again, because they were forming a union of actors in opposition to the all powerful studios. And it was really very dangerous work. It was work I know that my father was very proud and pleased to be associated with. And he was very quiet about it. He was involved with it from, as I say, its inception, right through the mid to late 40s, when he moved to New York from the Los Angeles, Hollywood area. But he felt that once an actor um, gained a voice in the profession, it was their duty to speak out on behalf of those up and coming actors that needed protection against some of the really harsh treatment that the early actors received at the hands of the directors and studios, because the early actors were treated like pieces of meat by the studios. My father lost 25 pounds just during the making of Frankenstein, and he was already a starving actor. Frankenstein Frankenstein was his 81st film, and he was the first to say that nobody saw the first 80.
So we know that he made at least 207 films, although that number seems really, really conservative, considering that some of his performances have been torn apart from those films and placed in other movies unofficially, left and right, as well as television appearances that used previously existing footage. It seems like there was a lot of piranhas and cannibals taking apart your father's career and reassembling it to try and make a buck, from the 50s onward. Now, in 1919, he starts with the serials, which is where a lot of actors at that time, especially that ended up being genre actors, did start. He was making westerns, very early westerns. He was making some science fiction. The first thing was something called Lightning Raider, which I don't think we have much that remains, unfortunately. But he was getting a decent amount of work in the silent era, and then he did something remarkable that I think most people don't realize, is that a lot of actors did not make the transitions to the talkies at all. Your father had
Right.
no such issue, and I think that has a lot to do with that amazing, instantly recognizable voice.
Well, he had a lovely voice, a wonderful British accent, um, but he also had a lisp, and which he um, learned to use or overcome. Somebody said to me, oh, I don't know, 15 years ago, well, what about his lisp? And I said, what lisp? I didn't even know that my own father had a lisp. But when he was a young boy, he not only had a lisp, but he had a stammer. He was the least likely candidate to become an actor. He was bow-legged. He he had a lisp. He had a stammer. So he really um, he paid his dues along the way to have the success that he had. But he was trained in England, being British. He was the youngest of 9 children, and he was, along with his 7 brothers, he was educated formally for the British Diplomatic Corps. And when he left home, he did so as the black sheep of the family. And he flipped a coin to see where to go to become an actor. And he'd only set foot on a stage, I think, in a 7th grade church play before he arrived in British Columbia. He flipped a coin between Australia and British Columbia to start his acting career. Shows you how much he knew about the theater business. And British Columbia won, and he arrived and thought he had a job with a farmer who'd never heard of him, but he let him sleep in the barn, and my father did 10 years of repertory theater and mixed with manual labor just to sustain himself until he made his way down to the States.
So so later on, your father would do work on both continents. He'd work both in America and in Britain
Yes.
throughout the years.
Not a lot in Britain, no. Not a lot in Britain.
Did you, if he was working in Britain, did you go over to Britain or did you stay in the States?
I was in the States.
Okay.
Yeah.
So 1931 comes along. Your father has 2 roles that year that have equal importance, actually. And one of them is one we talk about all the time. And the other one we talk about a lot less. But we're going to start with the one we talk about less because I think it's important to highlight it. He had a lot of critical success and a lot of instant notoriety for his acting chops, coming from a Howard Hawks film called The Criminal Code.
Yes.
Which was a gangster film, or a crime film, more appropriately, I guess. But he was really singled out as the performance to watch in that film. And on anyone else's career, that would be what made that year or maybe that decade for that actor, but not your father. Because also that year came out a little film called Frankenstein. And Universal had put all their eggs in the horror basket that year because Dracula had come out earlier and Frankenstein followed it. And with the production schedules, you have to realize that was a plan. I see too often people say that, oh, Dracula was so successful that they pumped out Frankenstein. No, that was an investment. That was something that went forward. So whereas the Criminal Code got all the critical acclaim for your father, the pop success, becoming a celebrity, came out of Frankenstein, even though the film didn't properly credit him.
He wasn't even invited to the premiere.
Right. So that's an incredible year for anyone, any actor, anywhere. It might be the best year for any actor ever. I can't. I mean, the one thing I will say is like, and it's because of the earliness of this, but there weren't proper awards to be won. So that would be the only thing that would have made it better. Now you were still a few years off from this, so I don't expect firsthand knowledge, but did he ever talk about what an amazing year 1931 must have been?
He never talked about his work. He never brought it home. He never talked about his career, except in interviews, of course. And he always said that he was the luckiest man on the face of the earth to be able to spend his life doing what he was passionately loved and then be jolly well paid for it. And he meant it. I mean, he loved what he did. Um, as I said earlier, he'd paid his dues. He'd come up. He'd been in British Columbia 10 years doing repertory theater for 3 different groups, sometimes getting paid, sometimes not. And then he'd spent 10 years in Hollywood when nobody knew he was in Hollywood. And as he said several times, he started out as an extra and third from the left in the fourth row, and then moved on to some bit parts. And when they began to dry up, rather than go back to extra, he started driving a truck and hanging around the lots until there was more bit part roles available. But he was not going backwards after having worked that long and that hard to get to that point. And then along came Criminal Code. He was in the play first and then cast in the film, and in a small but showy part. And then, unfortunately, Chaney Sr. died at an early age, and then Bela turned down the role of Frankenstein, and my father was offered the opportunity to test for it, and thanks to the genius of Jack Pierce's makeup and to the genius of James Whale's direction, and thanks to the interpretation of my father's performance of the role, it was a perfect marriage of talents, and nobody expected or knew if Frankenstein would be the hit that it was, and nobody expected the creature to be the star of it. They all expected Colin Clive to be the star of it, and so it was full of surprises for everybody, but it turned out to make cinema history and has stood the test of time thanks to the fans.
Absolutely. What I find fascinating is that it's hard for any of the generations that came after the film's release to really get that this film was the Exorcist or the Jaws of its day. It was monumental. It was lines around the block waiting for the next showtime. It was the hot ticket to movies for that whole year. And it was, importantly, I use those examples for a reason, because we tend to think of old monster movies as kiddie fare. And that's not what Frankenstein was in its day. It was not just, scenes of throwing little girls in rivers, but it was a fairly, I don't want to say controversial, but it was definitely on the pulse of edgy entertainment for its time.
Well, Mary Shelley's book in and of itself, although the film certainly doesn't follow her book, the film poses some of the same philosophical and religious and scientific questions that her book posed. And so it had that same quality as her book had. Then it had the genius of Jack Pierce's makeup, and as I said, the brilliant direction of James Whale, and my father's portrayal, and all of this together made it just an unexpected experience when one went and sat in the theater seat and watched this film. It was a frontier breaking film, and it just has been so ever since. It's always made one of the 100th best films ever made. Although Bride of Frankenstein has always been, I can see the smile on your face, your favorite film.
It is my favorite film.
But Bride of Frankenstein is considered to be the best sequel ever made. And for some of the same reasons, I think Bride has more humor, of course, and more irreverence in it. It, like some of my others of my father's films, like The Black Cat, one wonders how it got past the censors.
Well, it barely did.
Yeah.
I mean, it lost almost a full reel of the subplot with Carl at some point. But let's not get to Bride yet, because I'm going to get fixated on that, and that's going to be its own problem.
I know you are.
It's going to be a problem. Everyone in the chat knows it's going to be a problem too. That's what they're waiting for. They're like, Lauren is going to derail this thing. But I want to ask about James Whale before Bride, because I mean, it's only the next year, it's 32, that your father works with him again for The Old Dark House.
Yes.
Which is a film that actually I see is kind of a dry run for Bride of Frankenstein, because you start to see the dark humor invade there, where it really wasn't in Frankenstein. But in Old Dark House, you see the gallows humor start to show, and you see some of the satire and a lot of the themes of alienation and being the outsider start to appear there. So what was the relationship between your father and James Whale?
They had great professional respect for one another.
So Old Dark House has one thing that I think that cinema today could definitely take a lesson from, which is it trusts its characters and it trusts its audience. You watch that film, it never talks down, and the characters are never played down. And I really wish we had more of that. I constantly am talking about the fact that the reason I love films from the 30s, and by the way, as a side for everyone in the chat, there's going to be a video on my 30s horror film collection very soon. And it's going to be a long video because it's like too big a collection. But what I love about this period, and we started to lose it as early as the 40s, so I'm not picking on today necessarily, but the 30s as a timestamp, it was just the audience was treated almost as an equal when you walk through the door to the theater. You can feel a reverence to the audience. And today it really feels like we're being talked down to. Do you feel that way?
My father did not like the word horror, preferred the word terror. And one of the reasons was that he felt when it was terror, it left a lot up to the imagination and participation of the audience, wherein horror is more gore and less suspense and less involvement of the audience's intelligence and imagination. And so I think these early films that we're talking about are more intelligent films and treat the audience as being more intelligent.
With very few exceptions, I will underscore everything you just said. It's very, very true. There are the rare exceptions today. There's films like Hereditary that come out and they actually treat the audience as an equal, but in general, no, we don't get that today. So 1935, Bride of Frankenstein.
Here we go.
Yes. Your father didn't want to make a sequel. Didn't want the monster to talk. James Whale didn't want to make a sequel. Didn't want to repeat himself. Colin Clive was not in good health and did it for a paycheck. So why is it a brilliant film that fires on all cylinders? Why is every frame in that film a painting? Why does Bride of Frankenstein rank easily, no matter who you are, in the top films ever made? How is a project that seems like a studio cash-in such a brilliant piece of filmmaking?
They all knew what they were doing.
That's probably understating it. I think it's an amazing, even someone like Valerie Hopkins, her last name Hopkins, who was the replacement of Frankenstein's wife. First name's Valerie.
Yes.
Yeah.
Valerie, yeah, I know.
Yeah, she's been criticized over the years as being the weak peg, but I don't watch the film and see that. I think she's handed some dialogue that's a little over the top at times, but I think she does fine about selling it.
It's a surprise to the audience.
Yeah.
I mean, it's an unexplained surprise to the audience, I think.
Well, today I guess we'd be more used to recasting, but at the time, yeah. So Bride is also a big departure from the original Frankenstein because it unabashedly goes into this kind of dream logic, fairy tale, hyper reality. It's not trying to sell you a hard and fast, scientifically plausible story at all. It is saying, okay, we're in a different place and we're a different time. And your father's performance and his vocal performance in that film relates to that. It is a big performance, but it never feels fake or artificial. It always feels, in fact, I'd say it feels even more genuine. And if you didn't feel anything for the monster in the original film, you can't get 5 minutes into Bride of Frankenstein without feeling his pain.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, Heggie is brilliant in it. And Thesinger is magnificent in it. I mean, he is the epitome of slimy evil and
oddly Shakespearean. Yes.
Yes. And I mean, the addition to the cast, it just wonderful. Just wonderful. So the poignancy of the blind man and the humor, and it's what is Heggie's first or last name? First name, the blind man. It's just brilliant performances, and that's what adds to the work of all of the others who knew what they were doing.
So, without putting you on the spot here, of your father's horror work, which I know you don't like scary movies, but would you say Bride is your favorite?
I wouldn't say.
Ooh, I like that. I like that. But I'm gonna just hear in my head that you said yes. So, 1939, Son of Frankenstein. But something happens between those two films. You. So, well, you were born in 1938 during the production of Son, correct?
Correct.
Okay, now I have a question because this drove me absolutely insane. I was online doing my research, and it was great refreshing myself, making sure, because I didn't want to come on and completely embarrass myself. But I came across this photo, and I was blown away. My first thought was, oh my God, this is awesome. I'm staring. And then a logic problem hit me. So maybe you can solve a little bit of a mystery for me. I found this photo.
That's neither my father nor me.
It's being attributed as being you, and that makes a lot of sense because Son was the last performance of your father as the monster, and that girl is older than 6 months old. So this can't be.
How clever of you.
Clever would have been me figuring that out on my own. Reality is, I didn't figure it out on my own.
Is that my father in that picture?
It's hard to tell because the angle is so far off. I don't think it is. Do you think that is Glenn Strange?
Yes. And that may be Margaret O'Brien.
You may have solved a mystery. I'm telling you, that photo is attributed to you on multiple places.
Oh, online. I know that. People send me that photo to sign.
Do you sign it?
No, I send it back and I say that's neither my father nor me.
So let's sidetrack for a second. Well, I just wanted to clear that up because I kept finding it attributed to you, and then I couldn't quite figure it out. I was like, this can't be, but it is. According to these people. Yeah, well, that makes more sense.
Because you can look also at the photo that's widely distributed of my father at the hospital holding me as a baby.
So back to the narrative now that I've satisfied my own curiosity and confusion.
And in this picture that you just showed, the outfit is black, and Son of Frankenstein, the vest is brown.
That's correct. So that's
So it can't
Ghost.
be
That's
my father.
definitely from Ghost. It probably just doesn't have the ruffled vest over it.
Right.
That's something I'll investigate on my own. Neither of us really need to go there. But 39, Son of Frankenstein is released, and it was a film that almost didn't happen because both Britain and America went through a 1.5 year ban on horror films. And it wasn't an outright ban. I've described this before as just it became very hard to release horror films, so the studios weren't doing it. Then there was some repertory release showings of Frankenstein, Dracula, and King Kong.
Mm-hmm.
And they must have made a lot of money because Universal started the engine back up. Now, your father had been reluctant to come back for Bride of Frankenstein, despite what inarguably was a strong screenplay. What convinced him to come back, do you think, for Son?
I haven't a clue. I never asked him. He never talked about it publicly that I'm aware of. I don't know that he was asked that question in an interview. Maybe he was. I've read an awful lot of articles of interviews of his, and I've never seen an answer to that question.
Either have I. He later on, much later on, would have given a kind of discussion about why he left the role in general. He wasn't talking about any specific film. When he said it just had run its course and he didn't see there to be anything more to be done with the character. He did return, but never to the character for the franchise.
Correct.
But he called House of Frankenstein a clam bake, infamously. Just everything thrown in a bag, and we hope it works, right?
Right.
Right. And I would argue that he was always professional and he's very good in it. But it's a little bit sad to see him in the franchise, not in his signature role. So I almost wish he hadn't come back, only because he was doing so much else by then that I think was so worthwhile that it was almost a step backwards.
Well, I think it would have been sadder to see him come back in the role.
Because his heart wouldn't have been in it?
Well, he was older. The role was a very tough role. The wardrobe was very cumbersome. The makeup was horrific. I just think it would not have been the same class of performance.
So in 1945, 10 years on from Bride of Frankenstein, the Universal years are over. He goes to RKO and hooks up with Val Lewton, fresh off of Cat People, another of my favorite film, not a Karloff film, but another of my very favorite films. And we get some productions where he's given star roles with something to chew on again. And it's another big rejuvenation of his career with The Body Snatchers, Island of the Dead, and Bedlam. Those films, really, you can see him spark with the material again.
Yeah. So,
I mean, especially like those films are probably maybe a little easier for you to watch and enjoy.
Oh, I enjoyed those, especially The Body Snatcher. I know my father liked and enjoyed Val Lewton. Those two men liked one another, respected one another. Excuse me. They were both well-educated, articulate men, and he said that Val Lewton saved his soul with good material and good films, good direction, good scripts, and he was very grateful for the opportunity to do those 3 films.
So there is a wonderful box set of the RKO Val Lewton films that is available on DVD, and I believe it's been ported over to Blu-ray, but I don't think they're fresh scans, so buyer beware. It's an amazing box set that really showcases your father's work in a time period I think that's very underrated and not discussed enough. It's easy to talk about the Universal years, but I think the RKO years are probably they're equal. I'd say Bride is the thing that elevates Universal slightly above, but as a body of work, the RKO years are just amazing and should not be slept on by anyone. So I'm going to jump ahead again. 1955, British television, Colonel March of the Scotland Yard,
Yes.
a television series. In particular, to our audience's interest, there's an episode in which he appeared with Christopher Lee in a fairly early role for Christopher Lee. And this is almost a passing of the baton moment in a way, because it's like one generation of horror icon is passing the baton to another generation. Even though it didn't happen inside the genre, it's there on the screen. And they would work together again another 10 years on in Curse of the Crimson Altar, or The Crimson Cult, which I regard as the last great Karloff film. Through no fault of his own, it's just the last great film he was in. Did he ever discuss Christopher Lee? Did you ever meet Christopher Lee?
Yes, to both.
Okay.
They were next door neighbors in London at one time. They were good friends. I knew Christopher. I was in his home when they dedicated a house in which my father was born, with a blue plaque in London. I invited Christopher to come and speak. So yes, I knew him. And my father and he were friends and even neighbors.
And there's another one, those rare gentlemen that's referred to by everyone as a gentleman.
Yes.
Yeah. So let's change gears a bit and jump ahead to the next decade. 1966, your father's next big signature role comes from a place that I think most probably wouldn't have expected. Collaboration with Dr. Seuss.
Yes.
So How the Grinch Stole Christmas may be the best use of a recognized voice in cinema history. I cannot, when they announced they were making a new film adaptation of How the Grinch Stole Christmas, I cringed inside, not because of the casting of the film, though I had problems with that too. I just said, you can't make this without that voice. You can't do it. To me, that's the heart and soul of that rendition of the classic Dr. Seuss story. Your father must have had a lot of pride with it, because he seems to be, even in just the voice that we can hear, he seems to be overjoyed to be performing.
Oh, he loved doing that. My father, as I've said, my father never brought his work home or spoke about it. But one night, I was married and had 2 children, and one night the phone rang, and it was my dad, and he said, if you're not busy tonight, I've done something I think is pretty good. And I mean, never, all the television work he did, everything. And I think maybe you and the boys might enjoy it. I think it's pretty good, and the boys might enjoy it. Yeah, pretty good. And it was The Grinch.
That's classic Boris Karloff underselling right there.
Yes.
That amazing humility.
Only time he ever touted anything he ever did. He did 20 children's albums, recordings of fairy tales and Rudyard Kipling and for Cademan Records, and but The Grinch. He loved doing The Grinch.
I think you can tell.
And when he won a Grammy for it, he was in England, and his agent called him, and my father said, well, you go and accept it for me. That's fine. And so when my dad came over from England, the next time to Los Angeles. He went to his agent's office, and his agent said, "Here, Boris, here's your Grammy," and held it up for my father to see and take. My father took it and looked at it and said, "Looks like a bloody doorstop." That's how into awards my father was. And so he took it and he walked over to the door and he put it down at the door and he left it there.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
The 60s were a really interesting period for your father because, the decade had begun with a television show, Thriller, which lasted for two full seasons, very much kind of in the Alfred Hitchcock's Presents mold, but definitely with its own character and its own presence. And a lot of those introduction segments are just,
they're wonderful.
they're amazing because they capture so much personality. The only one else I think ever did that, like Hitchcock did Hitchcock, you know what I'm saying? But as almost a character. But
yes.
There was something more genuine about your father's introductions that I think is
he had fun doing them.
And it was a decade also, whereas there was comic book publishers and book publishers using him to promote their products. And
he had a comic book series with 97 issues.
Yep.
And then Dark Horse converted them into hardback books, and they're wonderful, beautiful job, just a beautiful job. So they're available for the fans now.
And anthologies of short stories as well, carrying his name and his brand. So yes. I mean, the horror side was still going strong, but also now there was this new career as vocal work for children's entertainment, both on record and on The Grinch. And another thing that we'll get to in a second, but I want to point out that in 1963, though, because your father, either he loved working or he was just extremely interested in seeing how he could push himself, goes to Italy to appear in Mario Bava's Black Sabbath.
Yeah.
An anthology film that was as cutting edge to the genre as anything made that year. So it wasn't as if he was just resting on laurels. This was a hardcore piece for 1963 from one of the most important emerging voices in horror. So his segment was basically a short, so I don't think he was gone for that long. But did he ever discuss it with you? Was there any kind of? Have you seen it?
No.
You might actually be justified saying that one is scary.
I've seen cuts from it.
It's a remarkable work, and it's his is the best segment of the three that formed the film. It is remarkable, though, and it was great to see him again. If he had passed the baton a few years earlier to people like Chris Lee and Vincent Price, it was him still saying, "Wait, but I'm still here. Yeah. I can still play with the best of them. Don't make a mistake." And I love that. It's pretty amazing.
And he also did Reader's Digest radio program for children for years. That was on every week. He did a huge body of radio work, just a huge body of radio work over the years.
Again, that voice.
Yep.
That voice.
And he, he also had another series called The Veil on television, and guest starred on every prominent TV show of the day, spoofing his own boogeyman image mostly, and enjoying doing that. So I mean, he loved working, and he was a consummate professional. And then, of course, his Broadway work was unbelievable. He starred on Broadway in Peter Pan. First of all, of course, in Arsenic and Old Lace in the 40s. And he turned down the role first when it was offered to him by Lindsay and Krause, and they finally talked him into it. And then he went to rehearsals, and his old stammer came back.
Really?
Yeah, his old stammer came back.
Wow.
And he kept blowing his lines because he had he'd been in film so long that it had been take one, take two, and so this there was not going to be any of that. And all of these Broadway actors, and he'd been so long since he'd been on the stage, so he kept blowing rehearsals and kept blowing rehearsals. And he finally took himself for a walk one day and thought, this is not fair to the others. This is not fair to anybody. I am going to withdraw. And so he went back and told them his decision at the next rehearsal. And they talked him out of it and said, please, Boris, just try it one more, give it one more shot. And it worked fine. And it was, and I have a phone ringing in a drawer. I put it in a drawer. And so he went back and it was fine. And he got over his stammer and he remembered his lines. And Arsenic was on Broadway for well over 2 years. And then he toured with it in the Pacific for the troops. He was he was invited to perform in Anchorage, Alaska in it. He owned that role, of course. And he loved doing that. And then he went on later to star in Peter Pan as Captain Hook and Mr. Darling. And then of course, he starred in The Lark opposite Julie Harris, which was he said that was just the peak of his career. Julie and he just adored one another. And they were both nominated for a Tony, and she won and he did not. But he said it was just probably the favorite part of his career was doing The Lark with Julie Harris. Then he did On Borrowed Time and The Linden Tree. So he was on Broadway in 5 plays, which, I mean, he was in every form of media and entertainment. It was just an amazing career.
It's amazing that, unfortunately, when you typically hear conversations about your father's work, it focuses on the 30s and somewhat the 40s, and that's it. And when you really look at the 60s,
television.
Excuse me?
Television, except television.
Yeah. But you look at the 60s. He was one of the
very first actors to move to New York in '49 to embrace the new medium of television, and that was a huge move to do that. He felt that was a new medium, and he was ready to take up that challenge. Since the film business, he'd been so active and fortunate through the 30s and 40s, but maybe it was time to move on to some new format. And he did very well on television.
Extraordinary.
Yeah.
So in 1967, there's a year after The Grinch, there was what I consider to be a celebration of your father's work for the generation of monster kids that would come forever after. And it's called Mad Monster Party. Not only is your father, the voice of Boris von Frankenstein in it, but several of the characters are based on him, even though they were all voiced by Alan Swift. But it is an absolute celebration of so much that your father created. And even though it's posited as for kids, I think most adults who love these films probably love them even more. I realize he probably didn't call you and say, hey, I think you and the boys will love Mad Monster Party.
No, he did not.
But it really is the celebration of him as an artist that he so richly deserved, and it is another thing for all time. Whereas The Grinch is awesome on its own as its own thing. It wasn't about Boris Karloff, whereas Mad Monster Party pretty transparently is about Boris Karloff. And you can hear that same spark in him that he really loved doing it. I think he liked working for children, period. But
oh, yes, he did.
And then the next year, he goes in a completely different direction. Peter Bogdanovich's Targets.
Yes, my favorite film.
Certainly seems like a emotional autobiography, if not a literal one, about an aging genre star who's facing his mortality, but also facing a legacy. And it's about film. It's a pretty remarkable film that takes the exact right actor at the right time in his life, the right story, and does something meaningful. Was it hard for you to watch the film? Because I can't put myself in your shoes on this one. Was it hard to watch that movie?
It is hard for me to watch that film, but it is my favorite film. My father is essentially playing himself. I know a little bit of backstory about the film, and it, of course, came out at the time of the Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy assassination, so it was pulled from the theaters prematurely and put on the shelves for quite a while, and then it was released in DVD format. It spoke to how my father really felt, that the real terror, the real horror, was on the streets and not up on the screen, and needed to be confronted, no matter the cost. And that was my father's real philosophy of personal philosophy, and that of the main character in the film.
Yeah, if any of you have not seen Targets, you need to see Targets.
Oh yeah,
it
is timely today as it was of the day it was made. Unfortunately,
it might be more so with what's going on in the streets today. It probably is.
It is a brilliant film. It is a tough film. It's almost a biography on my father. It's my father playing himself. Peter Bogdanovich wrote it and directed it and performed in it, and my father admired Peter's creativity and the entire project. My father really, really enjoyed doing that film with Peter.
It was a chance to not quite leave the stage, because he didn't leave immediately, but to have a proper goodbye in a way to the audience that had supported him for so many decades. But he wasn't quite done.
He had a soliloquy in that film that he did in one take. And at the end of it, the whole crew stood up and applauded.
He's amazing in it. I mean, he's never less than very, very good in anything. Even when, as we talk about the rest of this year that we're in, even as things get tough for him, he's never less than very, very good. He is amazing in Targets. And again, he was not the guy that the Academy Awards would round around, but it's hard to see why they didn't in this case. It is an amazing performance. But 68 is 68. So we have what I consider the last great film from him in the genre, which is Crimson Cult. It's just one of those films where it's a modern monster mash. You have Christopher Lee, you have Boris Karloff, and you have Barbara Steele. And if that doesn't sell you on a movie, I don't know what can. Any horror fan worth their salt has to see that film. And it's a lot of fun. Everyone seems to know what it is, and they're having fun. It seems like it's a very swingy 60s sort of movie with lots of psychedelic elements. but it all works, and it's great seeing your father alongside these other thespians who had kind of taken up his mantle inside the genre. Finally, yes, he'd worked with Christopher Lee on television, but now they were where they belonged. It was almost a family reunion for the genre. Have you ever seen it?
No.
Now that one I'm going to actually challenge you to, because it's not actually scary at all, even though there's kind of dark themes and it's based on Lovecraft. It's more fun. And to see his interactions with these other character actors is just, it's great stuff. But then, unfortunately, the last 4 films of his career were they were all shot by his scenes were shot by Jack Hill, and then the films were assembled around him, mostly posthumously, in Mexico. 4 films which I can't recommend really to anyone, unfortunately. Your father would be the only reason to see them. Because again, even at his worst, even in extreme pain and discomfort, he was never less than very, very good. For the record, those are Island of the Snake People, Alien Terror, Cauldron of Blood, and House of Evil. And a lot of histories of horror that talk about this period with your father kind of play it off as, well, he just did it for the money, or he did it for... And I don't think any of that's true.
Mm-mm.
I just think he was a guy who liked to work, and he appreciated the challenge of going in and doing scenes.
And he also said to me one time about that period, he said, American International, or he said this company, has just signed me to 7 films. And if they have that much confidence in my longevity, I guess I better stick around and fill out the contract.
And as rough as those films are, again, he still does shine. You could definitely see, wheels are slowing down, but he isn't slowing down. That spark is still there. And I wish there were better films, but in looking over his entire history of work, any actor would be lucky to have half as many good performances, let alone great performances. So ending on the note it does, I always choose to see Targets and Crimson Altar as the end of his career, because I think in their own ways they're high points, right? One purely for the art, and the other one purely for the joy of the genre. Let's go through the comments here. Let's see if anyone has anything for you. Well, they do, definitely. So let me find. You kind of answered that already. Well, Jacob McCullen, who actually is a big fan, I know. I just want to read this comment. It's not really a question, but he says, Targets is great. Aside from his work with Bobbit, is my favorite thing he did post RKO Luton.
Thank you.
Yeah. Someone, and I've lost the comment here, I want to get them proper attribution, asked about your feelings about The Mummy, which is actually the shirt I'm wearing. So what do you think of The Mummy?
I think it's a love story, and I think the sets are gorgeous. I think it's a lovely film. I managed to sit through it by myself. I mean, in one sitting.
And it was Mr. Jeff Overing who had that comment for you. It actually reads, what does she think of The Mummy? I just watched it on Blu-ray. So that's the thing. An entire another generation is discovering your father's films on a new format. And I think that's amazing. Jess Graham asks, I know the play On Borrowed Time. It's a good one.
Yes.
It certainly is. Jess Graham also says that Sarah is a great interview, and I couldn't agree more wholeheartedly. Stone Gassman, who I believe has a question for you that I'll take offline, but he says everyone needs to see Targets, and that's definitely true. If you grew up watching the old monster movies starring Boris Karloff and Bela Lugosi, and it's important that you understand that Targets directly kind of addresses those, but contrasts them, and it puts our beloved genre in the right light. It's an amazing film for doing that because, as Sarah said, it's kind of suggesting that we could never put on screen anything that could compete with what could go down in a convenience store on a Friday night. And I think that it's a remarkable film. It is part of the genre, although it's not perhaps the part of the genre that most people would easily define. And I think it is essential that people absolutely check it out.
It's wonderful.
Stu1 says, "Hi, Sarah. Would you like to see a movie based on your dad's life? And if so, who do you think could portray him? Thanks."
Jeremy Irons.
Oh, good choice. That's really good choice.
Yeah. But there have been, efforts about a film on his life. And there was a biography done on A&E, which was very good, well done. And there's one underway, a documentary underway in England now that's looking for funding if anybody's interested. But that's very good and is done just a myriad of interviews, people who worked with my father and knew him. But the problem with doing a film is there's no dirt, there's no hook.
Well, maybe it doesn't have to be that kind of a biopic. I mean,
well, that's box office. That's the reality of it.
Yeah, that's true. However, I hope for there being better in people, and that we could celebrate a good man at some point. That would be a nice moment.
I hope this documentary being done by Thomas Hamilton in England comes to pass, because it's being very well done, and one should be done about my father, and it's all inclusive and certainly with family participation and support. But funding is very difficult to come by these days.
I completely agree with that. I see too many films that I look at and I say, if this had like $10 million more, it would have reached everyone. But it flies under the radar because it's so expensive to make film now. It's crazy. So I'm going to screw up this name. There's no question about it. But Sir Maya Histro says, who could portray a young Boris? So I guess he's saying that at the beginning of the career, Jeremy Irons is probably a little long in the tooth to play.
Yes, he is now.
Any ideas on a young Boris?
No, I'm not that well versed in the young actors of today.
I'd say James Pattison. After his performance in Lighthouse Guys, I could see it. He's he's currently going to be the next Batman, but he has the actual acting chops, and he has the kind of classical facial, British facial features of your father at a younger age. I think he could do it.
Indian features? See, most of my father's early work was ethnic because of the East Indian blood in the family.
You see, it's so funny because just like if you look at the photos I have in the middle of the screen, I always read that, and I've seen he's played Native Americans, he played Indians from India, the Raven, right? But if you look at the man in the center of the screen, I think he could have been from anywhere. And that was one of the gifts. It was the physical gift he had. And then above that, as an actor, he was able to utilize that. And to me, I never saw him shortchanged. I never saw him have to play any ethnicity. Within reason. Within reason.
No, but he did play, certainly in his early years in film, he played a lot of ethnic roles.
Yeah. Well, Hollywood was in a different place at the time, too. Definitely. Jacob McCullough asks, what do you consider to be his most sinister role? For me, it is the Black Cat. He is beyond malevolent in it.
It took me 3 times to finish watching the Black Cat. I've seen it several times since then at functions I had to sit through. Um, how it ever cleared the censors, I'll never know. I think it is a disturbing film.
I would agree with that.
Very disturbing film.
I'll be honest, The Black Cat is not one of my favorite of the time period. I am a cat lover, and obviously we know that cats don't do well in that movie. But beyond that, I just...
They didn't hurt a cat in that film.
He throws a knife at the cat.
Throws a knife.
He throws a knife, and in the next scene there's dialogue saying, why was he so upset when I killed the cat?
Oh.
It's not on screen, but it's there. But it's... to me, that film is less than The Raven. You okay?
Oh. I just think it is, it's a disturbing film on many levels.
Whereas
distasteful and disturbing.
But you see, I think The Raven, which is its counterpart in many ways, is just such a whimsical take. It's dark, but it has that sense of humor, that tongue in cheek, to get you through it. So that's why I always preferred it to Black Cat.
There is no tongue in cheek.
No, not in Black Cat. There's not.
Not in the Black Cat.
Nope. All right. Take the Ring asks, what does she think of the Abbott and Costello film? By that, I'm sure that's a reference to Abbott and Costello Meet the Killer, Boris Karloff.
I think Abbott and Costello were a wonderful comedy team. And, my father had a wonderful sense of humor. So I think it was a good combination.
And I think he was completely on page with those guys. He knew what he was doing. They were definitely singing from the same chorus. IMDb says Young Frankenstein is one of your favorite films.
That's right.
Is that true?
Oh, I love it.
It's so respectful and yet so funny.
Oh, it is hysterically funny. Everything Mel Brooks does is hysterically funny, but that's over the top funny. I must have seen it 10 times.
Jack Delhomme asks, since Boris never legally changed his name, why is Sarah's last name Karloff instead of Pratt? I think there's going to be a very easy answer to this one.
Because it's on my birth certificate. Yeah, on my birth certificate, it's Sarah Jane Karloff Pratt.
And you had an H at the end of your Sarah.
No, I do not.
No? I see. That's another piece of misinformation online.
I know.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry, another question. Don't be sorry. This is the chance. She's not coming back tomorrow.
There's a Sarah on that.
Yeah, there is a Sarah on that one. Do you or your family own any of the rights to the Karloff franchise, and do you have a say in what is released in any way? Thank you, and thank you for coming on this show.
You're more than welcome. I own the persona rights of my father, which means his voice and his face and his name. The studios own the films, and I have no say as to what they do with the films.
Right, because those are done deals. But if they wanted to put out an action figure featuring your father's likeness, then you would have to have some input, correct?
In some instances.
Okay. James Frost asks, did Sarah watch many films or plays with her father, and he spelled your name right?
I noticed that.
There you go.
My father didn't watch his own films. And many actors don't, because they would be wishing they could get up on that screen and do that scene differently. It was difficult to go out in public with my father because he was so easily recognized so that when we did go to places, one time he took me to a football game, and I can guarantee you for rows around us, nobody could tell you anything about the game. Riding in an elevator with my father was always an experience. People didn't know whether or not to mind their manners and leave us alone, but there was always a lot of elbow bumping. And then once we got out of the elevator, if you turned around, there was always snow. So, and before tinted glass in cars, if you stopped at a stoplight, there was a lot of pointing. So it was difficult to go to certain places with my dad. And to go to a play with my father, if the actors, if he knew the actors and they knew he was coming and they were comfortable with that, that's fine. But if not, they would be very nervous knowing he was in the audience. So
I can imagine.
So it was a matter of picking and choosing what we did in public.
Now, guys, we're going to be wrapping this up very shortly. So if you have any final questions, let's get them in. But Sara, I wanted to first just say, like for years, you've been doing the convention circuit and you've been kind of keeping touch with your father's fans, making sure that they understood that it wasn't just a one-way love affair. Like he loved that he reached people. He loved performing for children. He loved the impact the Grinch or the Bride of Frankenstein reached down to people. And I think that's an amazing thing. It's a selfless thing in a way. But how has that experience shaped your life, meeting his fans?
I really don't do the convention circuit. Please. I do a few conventions. Every year I do about 3. That's all. The first convention I ever did was the famous Monsters of Filmland convention in Crystal City in 1993, I think it was. And Bela Jr. and Ron Chaney and Dwight Fry Jr. and I were all invited, and we were all curious about what the other one was like. We never met. I think Ron and Bela had met, but the rest of us had never met. And so that was an experience for us. We'd never been to a convention, none of us. We'd never met one another. We didn't know what to expect, and we certainly did not expect the reception we got. It was overwhelmingly welcoming and mind-boggling. I mean, it was like we were the children of the night, and it was just to me. It was absolutely amazing. I didn't know this entire genre existed or this film land existed. And somebody asked me if I'd been down to the dealer's room. I thought they were playing poker. I kid you not. Somebody took me down to the dealer's room, and I discovered they were selling pictures of myself and my husband on our honeymoon when we went to see my father on the set of Frankenstein 1970. Pictures of myself and my father that had been taken of us on the balcony of the Chateau Marmont when I went to visit him. Pictures of myself that had been taken with my camera. But
I told you at the beginning you're horror royalty, and you might
it
not
was
accept it, but that room should have told you.
it was I mean it was absolutely remarkable, and the the four of us couldn't walk 5 feet without people asking us to sign things. I mean, I didn't know what they wanted me to sign. I signed more weird things that weekend than you can imagine. Um, it was absolutely well. That was my introduction to this whole thing. So from there, I learned a lot. Actually, I learned a lot that weekend from Bela and Ron that that there was a law that protected the rights of deceased celebrities' families. I learned an awful lot that weekend, and I learned about all the fans who could not have been more wonderful, and that was like 100 years ago. And I've yet to meet a fan that I don't like. I mean, they have been so gracious, so wonderful. I've learned so much from the fans. They know far more about my father, far more about his career than I could ever learn or know. And I and my family are so grateful to the fans. Um, I've been able to travel, meet people that I never would have had an opportunity to meet before, do lovely interviews like this, hear from uh, my father's fans wonderful stories about the impact that he has had on their lives. Uh, I get letters from people. We have a web page in which we have a tribute section where we've posted some of the letters that are just overwhelmingly touching about the stories they share with me about the impact my father has had on their lives. Um, it has had just an untold effect on my life. That one convention. Um, I used to stay home and clean my own oven, and and now I get all these wonderful letters and emails, and uh, and and I've learned so much about my father, about his career, about him as a person that I never knew before, and it's been the most remarkable experience and the most heartwarming experience. And there will, to my dying day, I will never be able to thank the fans of my father enough for what they have added to my life's journey.
Well, if anything, we have not begun to repay the debt.
Well, the debt is due my father, not me.
We can't repay him. You're here.
Well, I'm a conduit, and I
I'll
thank you
take
on
it.
behalf of my father.
If Darren Burroughs asks, if Boris was alive today, he would have been a multimillionaire. Did you make a really comfortable living out of his films?
I don't know that he would have been a multimillionaire. Um, no, he made a comfortable living out of his career. Um, um, and he paid his dues to get there.
So before you answer this one, I'm going to nitpick at something. Jess Graham asks, did Sarah or her children ever get the bug for acting or any other part of the business? Now, wait a second. Before you answer that, you did voice work in a low-budget zombie movie called Deader Country in 2009, which I've
Did
never
I?
seen. I've never seen it.
Nor have I,
How did
and
that
I don't
happen?
intend to. And I think I said 3 words, and I
That
think it was shot at Forey Ackerman's house. And I did it as a favor to Forey.
How well did you know Forey? Because he's responsible for a great deal of the fandom
Oh,
out there too.
families owe him an immense debt of gratitude. I knew Ford well.
So if there's a generation, unfortunately, that don't probably have the experience I had, which was later on in Famous Monsters of Filmland and Monster World after that, the fanzines that he ran for decades and decades. So I was lucky enough to catch the tail end of that, but there's an entire generation that came out post those publications who might not realize that Forey Ackerman was the kind of guy who had collected droves of memorabilia. And if you pulled up to his house and knocked on the door, there's a good chance he was going to take you on a tour.
Yeah.
And it wasn't going to be something you were going to pay for, though a lot of people tried to tip him afterwards. He was just the biggest fan of this genre ever. And for instance, the only reason we even have a photo of the spider pit scene from the original King Kong is because he owns the photo that proves it exists. He was the ultimate one of us. So Forey, we lost him a few years ago, and unfortunately the Acker Mansion was broken down and sold at auction, and pieces of it are everywhere. I wish it had been preserved. It should be a place we could visit to this day. For the final question, I think this is like the best way to end this. James Frost asks, what was the most important lesson Sara learned from her father, and that would be beneficial to anyone?
It's always easier to just do the right thing.
And I think that's a lot of the reason why we loved your father. Because in everything he did his best. He was a man of his word. Even when he signed on to projects that were fairly thankless, he was always the spark. He was always the bright spot. He always got your money's value out of it, even if no one else was.
Yeah, and he never just walked through a role.
And on those rare occasions where everyone around him was firing on all cylinders, you got the Bride of Frankenstein or the Body Snatcher or Targets.
Yeah.
Sara, I'm going to run a promo for the next show, and on the other side, we'll say goodbye to the audience, and I'll let you off the hook. I got to say, I reached out to Sara completely blind, just hoping that she'd be willing to come on, and she was nothing but awesome. We worked through the technical side of it, and that was even easier than I thought it was going to be. This was a great night for me personally. You have no idea what it meant to me, and I think we made a lot of people in the chat very happy, too, from the sound of it.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I had a lovely time.
I appreciate it. If you ever want to come back, just let me know. In the meantime, coming up on Monday, sorry, I was muted for that.
Yeah.
I was supposed to be automatically unmuted from that, and it didn't happen. So all I was saying is, Sara, thank you so much for coming on. The show will be back on Monday with Jay the Stingray, our old friend from the Sausage Factory. We'll talk about podcasting, the horror genre, commentaries, and just regular tomfoolery. In the meantime, Sara, thank you so much for coming on tonight. It's been an absolute joy. I hope you have a great night, and I hope this lockdown ends soon so you can get back out there to meet back with these people who obviously love you so much.
Thank you so much for having me on. I had a great time.
All right. Everyone, we'll see you on Monday.
He's a very old guy, knows a lot about horror.